under the golden morning light of the Mediterranean. I stood in my small pottery studio, my hands slick with clay, shaping delicate curves into a vase. Everything followed the same familiar rhythm, sunlight streaming through the open windows, the scent of ripe orange blossoms mingling with the salty sea breeze, and the distant hum of the waves. A peaceful, simple life, perhaps a little lonely. Until Mario appeared. He stood at the doorway, his silhouette familiar yet somehow distant, his eyes filled with unspoken words. I never imagined that his arrival would disrupt the carefully crafted routine I had built over the years. Between fragments of old memories and the stirrings of something new, I found myself facing an undeniable truth: life, much like clay, doesn't always take the shape we intend when our hands aren't quite ready. And so, it all began with that moment. The morning light streamed into my studio, golden and warm, casting a gentle glow across the room and transforming the terracotta tiles underfoot into a mesmerizing patchwork of sunlit patterns. The air was filled with the soft hum of the Mediterranean breeze, carrying with it the intoxicating blend of salt water and the sweet, citrusy scent of blooming orange blossoms. It drifted through the open windows effortlessly, like an uninvited yet ever-welcome guest, wrapping around me in a familiar embrace. My hands, slick with wet clay, moved with practiced ease, shaping a vase that seemed to emerge organically from my fingertips, as if it had always existed in the soft earth waiting to be revealed. These quiet moments, where my entire world was reduced to the feel of the clay, the scent of the sea, and the warmth of the sun, made me feel at peace, content even. Life here was simple, predictable, a delicate routine that grounded me, anchoring me to the present and shielding me from the ghosts of the past. Each morning followed the same familiar pattern. I would wake with the first light, push open the shutters to bathe the studio in the golden dawn, brew a pot of strong, black coffee whose rich aroma filled the space, and then lose myself in my work. This studio, perched on the edge of the coastline with an uninterrupted view of the turquoise sea stretching endlessly into the horizon, had become more than just a place to create. It was my sanctuary, my escape, my fresh start. But no matter how carefully I shaped my days, molding them with the same precision as I did my clay, there were moments of stillness that felt heavier than they should. Moments when the echoes of my old life seeped in through the cracks, bringing with them the sharp edges of betrayal and the lingering sting of Gabriel's deceit. 5 years had passed, yet the scars, though faint, remained, silent reminders of wounds that had never quite healed. I had poured myself into my craft, filling the empty spaces with purpose and creativity. And yet, despite the beauty I surrounded myself with, there was still an ache, a quiet longing buried beneath the surface, an unspoken desire for connection, for someone or something to chase away the loneliness that clung to me in the quiet hours. The sudden trill of the doorbell cut through the silence, jolting me from my thoughts. My hands stilled, hovering over the spinning clay, and I glanced toward the entrance, heart beating a little faster than it should. It wasn't unusual for tourists to wander in, drawn by curiosity or the allure of a unique souvenir, their chatter filling the space with a lively energy. But this time, there were no hurried footsteps, no cheerful voices. Instead, when the door swung open, my breath caught in my throat. Mario stood there, framed by the brilliant Mediterranean sunlight, his silhouette outlined against the golden glow. He was familiar, yet somehow distant, as though the years apart had etched new lines into his features. Ones I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. For a fleeting moment, I thought my eyes were deceiving me. He stood there in a slightly wrinkled linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows in that effortless way I remembered so well. A single travel bag was slung over his shoulder, its worn leather hinting at long journeys and restless nights. His dark hair was tousled by the breeze, his jawline sharper, more defined. And yet his expression, part hesitation, part relief, was unmistakably his. "Mario," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly, betraying my surprise. "Carmen," he said, his voice low and warm, tinged with an uncertainty that made something deep within me tighten. He took a tentative step inside, his eyes sweeping over the studio, taking in the shelves lined with carefully crafted ceramics, the work table scattered with unfinished pieces, before finally settling on me. My pulse quickened, and I wasn't sure if it was from shock or something deeper, something I couldn't quite put a name to. Mario and I had always been polite, even cordial, but distant. Growing up in separate households, our lives had run parallel without ever truly intersecting, making us more like familiar strangers than family. I hadn't seen him in years, and yet here he was, standing in my sanctuary, as if drawn by something neither of us fully understood. Wiping my hands on my apron, the clay leaving faint smears across the fabric, I took a cautious step toward him. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He hesitated, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight, his carefully constructed composure cracking just enough for me to see the exhaustion lurking beneath. "I needed to get away," he admitted finally. "Madrid, everything there. It's too much right now." I thought. His voice faltered, trailing off as he exhaled a shaky breath. "I thought maybe I could come here. See you." There was a rawness to his words that caught me off guard, and my chest tightened involuntarily. I saw it then, the faint shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the unspoken weariness that clung to him like a second skin. "Mario," I murmured, stepping closer, the distance between us shrinking. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw him for what he was, lost, searching, yearning for something familiar. Without thinking, I reached out, my fingers brushing against his arm in a tentative gesture of comfort. He didn't pull away. Instead, a small, tired smile tugged at his lips, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You haven't changed," he said softly. A wave of unexpected emotion crashed over me, gratitude, nostalgia, and something deeper, something I dared not name. "You have," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. And for the first time in a long while, the ache inside me didn't feel quite so heavy. He let out a breath, a sound that hovered somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. And before I could second-guess myself, I closed the space between us. My arms slipped around him in a tentative embrace. And for a fleeting moment, he tensed, his body stiff and unyielding. But then, slowly, he softened against me, his arms winding around my waist with a quiet certainty. The warmth of his body pressed against mine was startling, an anchor in the swirling tide of emotions that threatened to pull me under. "I've missed you," he murmured, his voice a whisper that tangled itself in my hair, delicate and raw. I pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, our faces so close that I could see the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. The air between us shifted, thick with all the words left unsaid. The moments lost to time and distance. His hand lifted, fingers brushing a stray curl from my cheek with a gentleness that sent a shiver down my spine. My breath hitched as his touch lingered. A silent question in the space between us. "I've missed you too," I confessed, my voice trembling with an honesty that felt almost too fragile to speak aloud. And then, without warning, he leaned in. His lips brushed mine, tentative, searching. It was a kiss woven from years of longing, of loneliness endured separately but shared in a way neither of us had ever acknowledged. The taste of him was familiar yet new. A quiet promise wrapped in hesitation and something deeper. Something neither of us dared name. When we finally pulled apart, the world around us seemed quieter. The air heavier with possibilities we were too afraid to face. He searched my face, his expression unreadable. And yet, I found myself unable to look away. "Welcome back," I said softly, my voice steadier than the chaotic rhythm of my heart. "Thank you," he replied, a faint smile playing at his lips as he set his bag down and stepped fully into the studio. As if crossing an invisible threshold. His arrival felt like the beginning of something unknown. Something neither of us was truly prepared for. Mario slipped into life at my studio as if he'd always belonged there. Yet there was an undeniable sense of newness in having him here. Our days soon found a rhythm, mornings spent nursing cups of coffee on the sunlit terrace. Afternoons meandering through the bustling market streets where the scent of fresh bread and salt air mingled. And evenings lost in quiet companionship beneath a sky freckled with stars. It was comforting, this unspoken routine. Even if we both tread carefully, avoiding the deeper waters of what had brought us to this sleepy coastal town. But one evening changed everything. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of amber and lavender, casting long, dancing shadows across the studio floor. The air was thick with the lingering warmth of the day when I suggested a walk along the rugged coastline just beyond the town's edge. It was a place that had always felt like mine, where the crashing waves and the endless sky had a way of silencing my most persistent thoughts. Mario agreed with a quiet nod, and we set off together. The narrow path wound through windswept cliffs and jagged rocks, uneven and dotted with patches of moss slick with sea spray. I led the way, pointing out hidden coves and weathered landmarks, sharing the small stories I had woven into this landscape over the years. Mario listened, his smile soft and attentive, his hands tucked into his pockets. But I could tell he was absorbing everything, the way he always did, seeing more than I ever said. As we rounded a bend where the cliff dipped closer to the sea, my foot slipped on a loose rock. It happened so quickly that I barely had time to react. One moment I was upright, and the next, my ankle twisted sharply beneath me, sending me tumbling forward with a startled cry. Mario was at my side in an instant, his hands gripping my arms, steadying me as I struggled to rise. A sharp, throbbing pain shot through my ankle, and I winced, sucking in a breath as I clung to him for balance. "I think I twisted it," I muttered through gritted teeth, my fingers tightening against his arm. "Don't move," he said firmly, crouching beside me. His touch was gentle but sure, his brows drawn together in focused concern as he examined my ankle. "It's already swelling. You shouldn't try to walk on it. I can make it back," I protested weakly, though the truth was I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "No, you can't," he said, his tone brooking no argument. Before I could protest further, He slipped an arm beneath my knees and the other around my back. Mario. You don't have to. Stop arguing, he cut in. His voice a mixture of exasperation and tenderness. I've got you. He lifted me effortlessly, cradling me against his chest as if I weighed nothing at all. My heart pounded in my chest. Whether from the fall or the closeness of him, I couldn't be sure. As he carried me back along the winding path, the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing below seemed to echo the unspoken tension between us. And in that moment, I realized that Mario had always been the one to catch me, whether I was ready to admit it or not. The heat of his body pressed against mine was startling. An unexpected surge of warmth that sent shivers down my spine. Instinctively, I clung to his shoulders as he carried me back to the studio. His grip unwavering and reassuring. The firm set of his jaw. The focused determination in his eyes, it all spoke of a quiet strength that I had never fully appreciated until now. Each step he took resonated with purpose. And I found myself lost in the rhythmic cadence of his breathing. The steady rise and fall of his chest against me. Once inside, Mario moved with deliberate precision, setting me down gently on the bed in the guest room as if I were something fragile. Something precious. The careful way he handled me made my heart twist in ways I wasn't prepared to acknowledge. Stay here, he instructed, disappearing for a brief moment before returning with a towel-wrapped bag of ice. Without hesitation, he eased my foot onto a pillow. His touch light yet confident as he pressed the ice gently against the swollen area. I sucked in a sharp breath at the sudden cold. But his hands were quick to steady me, offering silent comfort. Easy, he murmured, his voice a low, soothing timbre that melted through my tension. This will help with the swelling. He remained by my side, his fingers brushing lightly over my skin as he adjusted the ice pack with careful precision. The minutes stretched on in companionable silence. And as the numbing chill began to do its work, I found myself focusing on the warmth of his presence more than the discomfort in my foot. After some time, he set the ice pack aside and began massaging the area around the injury with firm but gentle hands. His touch was skilled, knowing exactly where to apply pressure and where to be tender. And slowly, the tightness in my muscles gave way to a soothing heat that spread through me like a slow-burning fire. You're good at this, I murmured, my voice filled with genuine gratitude and a hint of wonder. Mario glanced up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Architects need steady hands, he replied, his tone light yet tinged with something deeper. But I'm glad it helps. It does, I admitted, holding his gaze. Thank you, Mario, for everything. He shrugged as if it were nothing. But the tenderness in his expression betrayed him. There was an unspoken understanding between us. A fragile connection that neither of us had dared to name. Without thinking, I leaned forward, pressing my lips to his cheek in a soft, lingering gesture of gratitude. Mario stilled, his eyes widening slightly. And for a moment, everything hung in the balance. Our faces were so close now that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, I closed the remaining distance, pressing my lips softly to his. The kiss was unplanned, spontaneous, a reflection of emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. At first, he didn't move, frozen in place. But then his hand rose to cradle my face, and he kissed me back. The world outside ceased to exist as we lost ourselves in the moment, an unhurried, lingering exploration of something that had been waiting to be discovered. When we finally pulled apart, the air between us felt electric, charged with an intensity neither of us could deny. His thumb traced gently over my cheek, his expression a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. "Carmen," he whispered, my name on his lips like a question, like a promise. I reached up, my fingers grazing his, anchoring us in the moment. "It's okay," I whispered back. "Let's not overthink it right now." He nodded slowly, his gaze softening with something unreadable, something new. "You should rest," he said gently, tucking the blanket around me with a tenderness that made my chest ache. As he stepped away, I watched him, my heart still racing, my thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. Whatever had just happened between us, it felt like more than a fleeting moment. It felt like a door opening to something neither of us had expected, but something we could no longer ignore. The day unfolded with an unspoken rhythm between us, a quiet ebb and flow of shared existence that neither of us dared disrupt. The memory of the previous evening clung to the edges of my thoughts, like a soft haze that refused to dissipate, coloring every glance, every unintentional touch. Mario moved through the studio with an air of quiet purpose, his presence filling spaces that had once seemed cavernous and achingly empty. He belonged here, I realized, perhaps even more than he himself could understand. I found myself watching him more than I should have, captivated by the deliberate grace of his movements. There was an unhurried precision in the way he handled objects, the way his fingers brushed against surfaces as if committing their textures to memory. It wasn't just the way he moved, it was the way he inhabited the space, as though the studio had been waiting for someone like him to bring it to life. My injured ankle kept me confined to either the sofa or the bed, reducing my world to a few square feet and forcing me into a frustrating passivity I wasn't accustomed to. Mario seemed to take it upon himself to ensure I stayed put, his concern manifesting in countless small acts of care. In the morning, he brought me coffee, carefully balanced on a tray alongside a slice of toast. He propped pillows beneath my leg with meticulous attention, ensuring my comfort. His hands were gentle but confident as he adjusted the ice pack, his touch lingering just long enough to remind me of the unfamiliar sensation of being cared for so tenderly. By the time afternoon arrived, the sharp ache in my ankle had dulled into a persistent throb, a background hum that I tried to ignore. Mario, ever practical, suggested I distract myself with a movie. I agreed, though my acquiescence was more about pleasing him than any real interest in the screen. He chose a film I only vaguely recognized, describing it as something that grounded him. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. As the opening credits rolled, I found my attention drifting not to the story but to Mario himself. His face, illuminated by the soft glow of the television, told a story of its own. I noticed the way his expression softened during moments of levity, how his eyes clouded with a fleeting melancholy during scenes of sorrow. It was as if the film had unlocked a door to some hidden part of him, a depth I had overlooked before. When the movie ended, the silence between us was thick with unspoken words. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but rather a charged one, heavy with the weight of shared moments. Mario rose to help me back to my room, his hand firm and steady as he guided me. Once there, he insisted on checking my ankle again. His concern was palpable, evident in every careful movement as he peeled away the makeshift bandage and applied a fresh ice pack. His hands, warm against my skin, worked with a precision that bordered on clinical. And yet, beneath that clinical precision was something deeper, a tenderness that sent an unexpected warmth coursing through me. As he began to massage the area around the swelling, his fingers moved with a practiced ease that surprised me. It was a simple gesture, but it felt profound in its intimacy. I couldn't help but think about how natural this all seemed. How easily Mario had stepped into the role of caretaker. He didn't treat it as a burden, nor did he make me feel like one. It was a feeling I wasn't used to, and it left me both comforted and disoriented. When he finished, his gaze lingered on mine, his expression unreadable. There was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made my breath catch. Before I could second-guess myself, I reached for him, my fingers brushing against his hand. What happened next was unplanned. A spontaneous act born of gratitude and something else I couldn't quite name. I leaned in, intending to press a brief kiss to his cheek. But as I moved closer, Mario turned toward me, and our lips met instead. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as though we were both testing the boundaries of this uncharted territory. Then, almost imperceptibly, it deepened. His hand cupped my face, his touch firm yet impossibly gentle, grounding me even as my heart raced. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of us suspended in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. When we finally pulled apart, I was left with a heady mixture of exhilaration and uncertainty. Mario's forehead rested lightly against mine, his breath warm against my skin. Neither of us spoke, but there was no need. The connection between us was undeniable, even if it raised questions neither of us was ready to answer. As he stepped back, his hand lingered on my arm for a moment longer than necessary. I felt the absence of his touch acutely, as though a part of me had been taken with him when he left the room. I lay back against the pillows, my thoughts a tangle of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. That kiss, unexpected, electric, had changed something between us. There was no going back now, no pretending that the lines hadn't blurred. The days that followed slipped into a gentle, almost hypnotic rhythm. My ankle, though steadily healing, kept me tethered to the confines of the studio. Mario's attentiveness never waned, if anything. It seemed to grow. He took it upon himself to help with everything, from mixing clay to arranging tools to cleaning the counters that seemed perpetually dusted with a fine layer of powder. But it wasn't just the practical help that struck me, it was the way he inhabited the space. His presence breathing life into what had once been an isolating solitude. One sunlit morning, as golden light spilled through the wide-open windows, Mario proposed an idea. "Let's collaborate," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. He suggested a project where I would create a series of ceramic sculptures, and he would write accompanying short stories inspired by each piece. At first, I hesitated. The idea of sharing my art in such an intimate way felt daunting, as though I would be bearing a part of my soul. But his enthusiasm was infectious. He had already begun sketching ideas in a notepad, his brow furrowed in concentration. And before I could overthink it, I found myself nodding in agreement. The next few days were a flurry of creativity and collaboration. We brainstormed themes and designs, our ideas weaving together in a way that felt effortless. Mario's stories were vivid and poignant, each one adding a layer of meaning to my sculptures. His words transformed a simple vase into a vessel of memories, a small figurine into a symbol of unspoken longing. As we worked side by side, the studio buzzed with energy, filled with laughter and quiet conversations that felt as natural as breathing. The kiss we had shared lingered in the background, unspoken but omnipresent, A silent undercurrent that colored every interaction. With each passing day, the boundaries between us blurred further. Mario had become more than a companion. More than a caretaker. He was a collaborator. A confidant. And perhaps something more. The studio, once a space of solitary creation, had become a sanctuary of shared purpose. And though the future remained uncertain, I couldn't help but feel that something profound had taken root between us. Something that would continue to grow, shaping the days and weeks to come. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent beyond the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant hues of pink and amber, Mario turned to me with a spark in his eyes. His voice carried an almost boyish excitement as he suggested we celebrate the completion of our first collaborative piece. I hesitated, murmuring something about how it wasn't necessary. But Mario simply grinned, a grin so disarming that any protest I had dissolved before I could finish it. There was no arguing with that kind of enthusiasm. From the doorway, I watched him move about the kitchen with an ease I hadn't expected. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms dusted with flour. And his hair fell messily across his forehead. Evidence of his focus. There was something mesmerizing about the way he worked, effortlessly graceful. As though he belonged in this space. In this moment, the aroma of roasted herbs and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the salty breeze that drifted in through the open windows. It was intoxicating. A sensory symphony that seemed to turn the kitchen into something sacred. When Mario finally called me to the table, I was met with a sight that took my breath away. Candlelight flickered gently, casting soft, golden light across the dishes he had carefully prepared. The meal looked as though it had been plucked from the pages of a glossy culinary magazine. I couldn't help but smile, touched by the effort he had poured into every detail. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a gesture. An unspoken message wrapped in warmth and care. As we ate, conversation flowed effortlessly. Like a familiar melody we both knew by heart. We wove through memories of our childhoods, spoke of dreams we hadn't dared to share before, and laughed at stories that felt suddenly brighter in each other's presence. Yet amidst the laughter, there was something deeper in Mario's gaze. Something that tugged at a quiet part of my soul. It was vulnerability. Raw and unguarded. Mirroring the emotions I barely dared to acknowledge within myself. When the meal ended, Mario stood, his chair scraping softly against the wooden floor. From the counter, he retrieved 2 glasses of wine, the deep crimson liquid catching the candlelight. He handed one to me, his fingers brushing against mine with an almost deliberate slowness. Then, raising his glass, he offered a quiet toast, his voice low and steady. The flicker of the candles danced across his face, accentuating the strength of his jaw and the softness in his expression. We sat in silence for a moment, the air between us thick with words left unsaid. My heart beat faster as I sensed him leaning closer, as though drawn by an invisible thread that tethered us together. His eyes locked onto mine, and for an instant, the world around us seemed to vanish. Then, with a certainty that left me breathless, his lips found mine. The kiss was deeper, more deliberate than before, a connection so intense it felt as though the rest of the universe had slipped away. His hand cupped my cheek, his touch both tender and possessive, as though anchoring me to him. Time itself seemed to pause, leaving only the 2 of us suspended in that moment. When we finally parted, his forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the quiet intimacy that enveloped us. There were no words, Yet none were needed. Everything we felt was written in the silence. In the unspoken language we had created together. The night stretched on. The studio bathed in the soft, golden glow of the candles. Whatever boundaries had once stood between us had dissolved completely, leaving behind only the fragile yet undeniable bond that neither of us could ignore. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not just noticed, but understood in a way that made my heart ache with both joy and vulnerability. In the days that followed, the studio grew quieter, Mario's presence lingering in the corners like a faint echo. My ankle had almost fully healed, and I was slowly finding my rhythm again, shaping clay with my hands as the waves crashed rhythmically outside. Yet, despite the calm of my surroundings, my mind remained restless. I couldn't stop thinking about Mario, about the depth of the connection that had formed between us, about what it meant and where it could lead. When Mario first arrived, I had thought of him as family in only the loosest sense. My stepbrother, a word that had always felt distant and clinical. A title that barely scratched the surface of who he was. But now, every glance, every accidental touch, every lingering moment told a story that defied simple explanation. I found myself overthinking even the smallest gestures, how his hand would brush against mine when he passed me a cup of tea, the way his eyes seemed to linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking, the almost magnetic pull that brought him back into my orbit no matter how many times he tried to pull away. It wasn't just the kisses, though those haunted my thoughts with vivid clarity. It was the way he fit so seamlessly into my life, filling spaces I hadn't realized were empty. And that terrified me. I told myself this was temporary. Mario's time here was just a pause, a fleeting chapter in his otherwise busy life. He had his world, his projects, his ambitions, his life far beyond this quiet coastal town. Yet, the thought of him leaving pressed heavily against my chest, the weight of it growing with each passing day. That weight became unbearable the morning he told me he was leaving. I saw it in the way he avoided my eyes, the way his hands fidgeted at his sides, the way his voice wavered despite his attempt at steadiness. He didn't need to say the words, I already knew. He was going back to Madrid, back to the life he had put on hold to be here. That evening, I found myself pacing the terrace, the scent of the sea and the hum of distant laughter carrying on the breeze. My thoughts were a storm I couldn't quiet, emotions swirling within me, nameless and overwhelming. Mario found me there, his presence as steady and grounding as ever, even as tension hung between us like an unspoken truth. He stood beside me, silent, the weight of the moment pressing against us both. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to stop him from leaving. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned to face him, my heart pounding as our eyes met. There was a determination in his gaze, but beneath it lay something softer, something vulnerable. Without thinking, I reached for him, and his hand found mine. My lips sought his in a kiss that spoke the words I couldn't say, a plea, a hope, and a promise all at once. When we broke apart, his hands lingered on my face, his touch steady and grounding. I thought I had to leave, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. But now, I'm not so sure. And so, we stood there, the world around us fading into the background. The certainty of his departure began to waver, replaced by a fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to leave at all. That night, Mario didn't pack his bags. The suitcase remained in the corner, untouched. Its presence a quiet testament to his indecision, or perhaps to the shift that was slowly taking place within him. Instead of leaving, he stayed. He lingered in the space we had created together, as if the thought of leaving had suddenly become less appealing, less necessary. And though he never said it aloud, I could sense that he was beginning to see this quiet town, this fragile yet vivid life we had shared for a fleeting moment, as something more than just a temporary refuge. Perhaps, like me, he was starting to wonder if this place, this connection, could be home. Mario stayed, but the air around him still carried a sense of impermanence, like the last fading notes of a song that hadn't yet ended. He seemed caught in the delicate tension of wanting to belong and fearing what that might mean. I could see it in the way he moved around me, his presence warm but hesitant, as though every shared glance, every quiet word, held a question and neither of us dared to voice. Yet, there was no rush, no pressure to define what was unfolding between us. For now, it was enough to simply let it be. As the days passed, we slipped into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar, as though it had always been waiting for us to discover it. The mornings began the same way they always had, with the sea stretching out before us in its endless, tranquil beauty. But now, the air seemed different, charged with a quiet anticipation that neither of us could fully articulate. It was as if the world around us had taken on richer hues, as if even the smallest moments were brimming with unspoken meaning. Mario spent more time in the studio than ever before. At first, it was to help me, organizing shelves, kneading clay, cleaning brushes, but it quickly became clear that he was there for something deeper. He wanted to be near me, to share in the rhythm of my work and the solace it brought. His laughter often filled the studio, mingling with the steady hum of the pottery wheel. And I found myself savoring those moments more than I ever thought possible. There was a quiet intimacy in the way his hand would casually brush against mine, in the way his eyes would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking. It wasn't just the studio that brought us closer. It was everything, the late nights we spent on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, as the stars scattered themselves across the sky in brilliant constellations. We talked about dreams and fears, about things that mattered and things that didn't. Our voices soft and unhurried, as if the night itself was listening. On other nights, we walked along the shore, the sand cool beneath our feet, the waves curling around our ankles like whispers. Sometimes, we didn't speak at all, but the silence between us was never empty. It was rich with unspoken emotions, a quiet knowing that words could never capture. One evening, after a long, satisfying day in the studio, we sat down to dinner. The meal was simple: fresh bread, creamy cheese, ripe fruit, but the ease and warmth between us made it feel like a celebration. Mario was unusually quiet, his brow furrowed as he pushed his food around on his plate. His silence was different that night, not the kind that invited comfort, but the kind that hinted at thoughts too heavy to be spoken easily. I studied him, my chest tightening with curiosity and concern. The past week had shifted something between us, drawing us closer in ways neither of us had expected. I wondered if he felt it too, the pull, the possibility. But then again, maybe we didn't need to name it. Maybe some things were better left to unfold on their own. After we finished eating and poured the last of the wine, I began to clear the table. Mario followed me into the kitchen, his movements slow and deliberate, his expression unreadable. "You know," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about this place, about being here." I turned to face him, my heart beating a little faster. His eyes, dark and intense, held a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. He stepped closer, the air between us charged with something I couldn't quite define. "I don't know what it is," he continued, his voice low, almost hesitant. "This town, this life, it's nothing like what I imagined for myself. But I can't seem to picture being anywhere else. Not anymore. And then there's you." His words hung in the air, unfinished but complete. Before I could respond, his hand found mine. The warmth of his touch was steady, grounding, and yet it carried the weight of something unspoken. A promise, perhaps, or an invitation. Then he kissed me, not the tentative kind of kiss we had shared before, but something deeper, more certain. It was a kiss that erased every doubt, every question. It was a kiss that told me everything I needed to know. When the kiss ended, Mario didn't let go. He pulled me closer, his arms encircling me as if he was afraid I might slip away. His voice, barely above a whisper, reached my ears. "I think I could stay here forever," he said, his words a confession and a vow. And in that moment, I realized I felt the same. Whatever uncertainties the future held, they no longer mattered. We had found something real, something strong enough to withstand whatever storms might come our way. Mario wasn't just a fleeting presence in my life, he had become part of it, woven into its fabric in ways I hadn't anticipated. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The studio, once a quiet sanctuary for solitude, now hummed with life and purpose. Mario's presence had woven itself seamlessly into the fabric of my days. And his laughter, his touch, his quiet strength had become as vital to me as the sea breeze drifting through the open windows. We had both come to this small coastal town carrying the weight of our pasts, baggage filled with betrayals, wounds, and regrets we had tried to outrun. But here, in this place of sunlit mornings and starlit nights, we found something neither of us expected: healing. Mario stayed. Not just for me but for the life we were building together. With every collaborative project in the studio, every shared meal, and every tender kiss, we let the walls around us crumble. The lines that once defined us, step-siblings, strangers, lonely hearts, blurred until they disappeared entirely, leaving only two souls who had found something extraordinary in each other. The path ahead would not be simple. Life never is. But for the first time, neither of us feared the uncertainty. We had built something strong enough to withstand the storms, something rooted in love, trust, and a shared desire to be more than the sum of our broken pieces. As the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, casting the studio in hues of gold and pink, Mario turned to me with a question in his eyes, a silent invitation to take the next step, whatever it might be. And as I reached for his hand, I knew my answer had been written in my heart long before he ever walked back into my life. To anyone who finds themselves searching, lost, or uncertain, know this: it's never too late for a fresh start. Sometimes, the hardest part is letting go of the past to make room for something new. Love, connection, and belonging often come when we least expect them, but only if we dare to open the door. Thank you for joining me on this journey of love, healing, and rediscovery. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story that may inspire or touch your heart. I'll see you in the next video.